Hi, everyone. So before we get started, we're going to look at 1950s advertising today. But before we get started on that, I want to show a couple things that relate to the U.S. election that also bear on this course. So the first one I want to look at is an ad that came out from the Lincoln Project, and this is an organization it's an anti-Trump organization. It's actually comprised of Republicans who are against Trump. But what they've been doing is they've been making some pretty savvy ads, kind of cutting edge in some ways, that attack Trump and do it in a kind of tongue-in-cheek fashion, sometimes with a humorous vein as well. So this ad, it deals with Trump's recent bout with COVID. As you no doubt remember, he got COVID. A couple of days later, he was in the hospital, and he was there for a few days, and he came back. And he received an experimental treatment from this company called Regeneron. And he came out of the hospital claiming that Regeneron was a kind of miracle cure, that effectively that it had miraculously saved him from COVID and from serious illness. Now, in fact, it's an experimental treatment, right? So there's no real solid scientific evidence as to the effectiveness of this drug. But for Trump, he, of course, believes otherwise, right? So I'm going to show you this ad here. I've embedded it. And just look at the way it sort of taps into some of the things we've talked about with respect to the patent medicine tradition, the so-called miracle cure aspect of that, the way Trump performs the kind of testimonial, as a human sufferer of the illness, sort of giving his firsthand experience, etc. And then, but also it connotes the Barnum, Huckster, Hawking, the product kind of tradition. And so this ad that's lampooning Trump really incorporates all of this really well, I think, and it's quite something.
Hi, perhaps you recognize me. It's your favorite president. I got back a day ago from Walter Reed Medical Center. I went in, I wasn't feeling so hot, and within a very short period of time, they gave me Regeneron. A short 24 hours later, I was feeling great, and that's what I want for everybody. If you're in the hospital and you're feeling really bad, Regeneron. We have hundreds of thousands of doses that are just about ready. You're going to get better. You're going to get better really fast. Regeneron. Because I feel great. I feel like perfect. I want to get for you what I got. Regeneron. And you'll see some amazing things happen. You're going to get better. You're going to get better fast, just like I did.
So what I love about that ad is the way that it evokes a kind of 1980s era infomercial aesthetic. You see it starts off with the kind of the blue screen from almost like a VHS kind of thing, which if you're too young to remember what those were, I can't really explain that. But essentially, it very much evokes that, the sort of garish graphics, the sort of cheesy, cheery music that accompanies it. And this call now feature of it as well is really quite something. So for somebody who's watched a lot of infomercials in the 80s and 90s, there's something about that ad that really kind of connects with my own experience, I guess. And it's interesting too that he's both, again, he's the human sufferer, sort of offering the testimonial of his own experience, but he's also playing the Trump role, which is somebody who has this long history of doing sort of huckster promotion, right? Trump, promoting Trump University, Trump steak knives, and umpteen other sorts of Trump cologne, and umpteen other products that he's been hawking over the years, right, as part of the Trump brand. So it's a fascinating ad. If you go to the website, the Lincoln Project, you'll see there's a couple others that are quite funny as well. There's one called Covita, which is basically depicting that scene where Trump leaves the helicopter on the lawn of the White House and sort of walks up the steps, and they do a kind of satire or parody of the musical Evita in the context of what Trump is doing. And there's another ad called Walk of Shame. I won't give you any more about that, but it's quite inventive in the way that they encourage some women to think about Trump in the light of what we commonly think of as the Walk of Shame. All right. So I'm, as Trump is saying, 24 hours, I was feeling great. You're going to get better really, really fast, feel great, and I feel perfect. And that's how I'm feeling right now. And the reason why I'm feeling perfect is because, let me just kind of get to the next slide here. Is because there's a new Borat movie coming out. It's coming out on Friday. And I'm a huge fan of Sacha Baron Cohen. And I thought we could spend a little bit of time just thinking about Sacha Baron Cohen in light of the Trickster tradition that we talked about before. And you may recall that we talked about the Trickster as a kind of archetypal figure, a mythical figure in many, many cultures. And that's, even I made the case that Bugs Bunny would constitute a trickster figure today. But there are many others in different cultures that would have these kinds of characters, right? And these are characters that invoke laughter. They're usually pranksters or jokers. They're often shapeshifters, right? They can take on different forms. And that's, of course, totally relevant to Sacha Baron Cohen because, of course, he costumes up in so many different ways. In fact, he has to costume up for the type of art that he performs, his performance art, right? Because he can't have people recognize him because he's becoming more and more well-known, right? So if you've seen his earlier work with Ali G, and you've probably seen Borat, and even his series from a couple of years ago, Who is America? This is really about him being able to take on different personas and different characters and being able to perform his work. Now, what is essential to the Trickster is the idea of transgressing social norms and conventions, right? We talked about that. And those characters that Borat, or the Cohen Baron Cohen characters, what they do is they often, especially Borat, right? They transgress social norms and conventions. It's kind of squeamish or cringing to watch at times. But he does that to upend the powerful, right? He does it to upend dominant views in society that perhaps are harmful to others. And he tackles those sacred cows. And in this sense, what he does is a form of political engagement, right? He's actually a kind of public intellectual, but instead of writing essays or giving lectures or something like that, he mostly does his work for the public through his comedic roles. And he does it in a highly satirical way, and he engages people. Obviously it's funny, it's incredibly funny, but he usually does it to sort of pull the sheet off of some kind of troubling political view or some kind of power in society that is not helpful for the masses or the large group of people. So in that sense, he takes on sacred cows. And in fact, a character that Baron Cohen played in a recent movie called The Chicago 7, he played Abby Hoffman. And one of the lines from that is that sacred cows make the tastiest hamburger, right? You don't just sort of stand back and revere those sacred cows or those noble social conventions or whatever they are in society. You grind them up into Hamburg. And that's at the core, I think, the essence of the Trickster tradition. So there's a link here to a New York Times interview with Baron Cohen that was done a few days ago. Great interview. And the link here, I'm not going to show it, which is the trailer for the new Borat film that's coming out on Friday. I will be watching that. I can guarantee you, do not try and contact me Friday evening. And I'm not going to show the trailer because I'll just end up laughing as I've done the last five times that I've watched it or something like that. All right? But definitely, next year when I teach the course, I'll integrate more, I think, Baron Cohen into the Trickster tradition in terms of understanding that for a contemporary audience. All right? Okay, so let's see. Now we're going into the less exciting realm, perhaps, of, certainly not as funny anyway, the realm of the work we're going to do today. And in some ways, the work we're going to do today, looking at the 1950s, builds on what we talked about before, right? So for the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at advertising in the context of social change. And we've been looking especially at changes around urbanization, immigration, people moving from the country to cities, people finding themselves in new social settings, and then trying to figure out how am I going to figure out how I behave in these new social contexts, right? How do I know how to dress? How do I know how to act? How do I know whether to smoke cigars or cigarettes or whatever the case may be? And so people are going to be looking for help with that in terms of the process of social adaptation. And these advertisers we looked at last week in the 20s and 30s which Marchand calls the apostles of modernity, they were very much willing to help people do that. And they sort of self-arrogated to themselves the notion of them being a sort of counselor or almost a social worker of a sort to sort of help people with this new social transition. And we, in the light of looking at who they were, we saw that they were not representative of everybody. They were elite, Ivy educated men living in New York, had sort of higher brow social, cultural kind of backgrounds. And we looked at the kinds of ads they would likely have been producing in light of the concept of the Zerspiegel and capitalist realism. So capitalist realism is a kind of dramatization of the American dream. It's a reflection of your future self, your aspirational self, and that advertising would often sort of evoke that as opposed to the ordinary social circumstances of people. And then we looked at the metaphor of the Zerspiegel, which Marchand talked about. And that's the idea that ads were not just representing everything that was in society, they were very selective. And what they did select oftentimes was distorted, right? And I showed you the example of maids. Maids in the 20s and 30s were often depicted as French maids, when in fact the distortion involves the fact that they would have been African Americans if in fact you were looking at society as a kind of a mirrored reflection of what society was. So in this context, these advertisers started to understand the kind of personal and social insecurities that people were experiencing at this time. And they realized that they could capitalize on that in terms of certain ad appeals. And they went to the next step to think about how those appeals could target emotions far more so than reason or logic. And you saw the example of the scare copy, the worry copy, the anxiety kind of producing copy of the Listerine ads that I talked about last week. And so this is part of a broader context of advertisers trying to help people conform, trying to help them to kind of fit into this emerging mass society that is taking shape in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And so we're going to look at how advertising, as we get into the late 40s and 50s, sort of fits in with that mold, and even some of the kind of opposition to that as well. Next week, especially, we'll look at the opposition in terms of the 60s and what was called the creative revolution in advertising. But this week, we're going to look at the kind of core aspects of 1950s advertising. So a few things to think about or remember here. One is that the emerging dominant medium in the 1950s is television. So television is introduced in American homes in the late 50s, in Canadian homes in the late 40s. It's introduced in Canadian homes in the early 1950s, and it grows incredibly quickly. Television use. So in 1950, about 1 in 10 American homes would have had a television set. By 1960, it's almost 9 in 10. So that's an extraordinary increase in terms of the uptake of television use and television watching. So for example, that's 10 years, even the first 10 years of the internet in the 90s and early 2000s did not see that kind of increase in people subscribing to internet providers. So television is emerging as the dominant medium. So we'll be looking at some television ads today as opposed to print ads. And the other thing that dominates in this decade is the importance on the research and scientific tradition in advertising, emphasizing that far more so than the notion of what's creative or artistic about advertising. So we talked about that a few weeks ago, where we looked at those psychologists in the early 20th century and how they were trying to come up with socially scientific ways of determining what was effective about advertising. And so you see a kind of a carrying on of that tradition in the 50s. Lots of research, lots of social scientific involvement in advertising making. Essentially, you want to do research to find out what kind of advertising campaign to craft, like what's going to be the message, what's going to be the kind of nature of the creative, etc. And then you want to once the advertising is run, you want to test its effectiveness, right? To ensure that you're actually getting what you think you should be getting from that advertising. So there's that aspect, and then there's also something that involves the notion of how you create effective ad, and that's basically the idea of very simple messaging and with lots and lots of repetition. And so that essentially means, and you'll see this with the Anderson ads we'll look at today, essentially means you run ads that often get kind of irritating after a while because the message is so kind of blasé, and the force of the ad is just emphasizing or repeating various types of slogans or jingles and that sort of thing. So slogans and jingles, I mean, by jingles I mean kind of ad jingles, like musical tidbits that flow through ads. These become dominant as well during this decade. And then the last point about this decade, you see the emergence of a different type of testimonial. And that is the sort of what I sometimes call the voice of God kind of testimonial. And that's the idea of an authority figure advocating for a product, right? It could be a scientist, it could be a doctor, somebody who's speaking as a so-called expert in terms of their advocacy of something. So not those ordinary people we saw in the patent medicines of a few weeks ago, who were people that experienced the problem and were sort of touting the benefits of the product, like the Q-Ray bracelet or Lydia Pinkham or whatever. These are people that are not really seen as having the issue or the product or the problem associated with the product, but are nonetheless sort of advocating a kind of expert authority and counseling for its use. Okay, sorry. All right, so here is a representative advertiser from this decade, Rosser Reeves. So he was one of the more influential ad men from the 1950s. So he had he was born in the early 1900s and grew up as a Methodist. Was a fairly regular churchgoer and from a fairly strict religious family. And later I'll kind of reference why I think that's important. And he starts his sort of career working in a bank. He's doing sort of copywriting, sort of doing some in-house ad writing for a bank. And eventually he moves to New York in the 30s. He works at a few ad agencies. And then he gets a job at Ted Bates Agency, which was one of the largest ad agencies. He gets that job in 1940. And he basically starts moving up the ranks and becoming more and more highly recognized. So that by the time television advertising comes on the scene in the early 50s, he's kind of at the top of his game in terms of his presence in the ad industry. Reeves was one of those people who counseled a couple things in terms of his philosophy of ad writing. He believed that the public did not, he did not have a high regard for the public in terms of their capacity for, contemplating topics in nuance or being sort of insightful. He more or less had a low esteem view of the public. And so he thought the advertising that would work best should sort of reflect that. And so in part because of that, he developed these advertising campaigns that just focused largely on the repetition of single messages over and over again. And he especially would do this with Anacin and Colgate and a couple of the other products. He actually worked in the Listerine account for a while in the 50s. Linked to this was the idea of large media buy, right? So you may spend only $10,000 to produce a television ad, but you're going to spend hundreds of thousands, sometimes even millions of dollars buying airtime to run that ad on television. And television airtime is quite expensive in the 50s and 60s, in part because there were so few television stations. So in effect, it was more expensive to get your ads on the air because there was a limited supply of airtime. So you spend lots of money on these large media buys, and you basically promote these messages over and over again in very repetitive advertising. And then later in the 50s, as well, he would start to do political advertising. He worked with the Republican Party, with President Dwight Eisenhower's campaign. He became a little bit famous for that as well, although I won't go into that so much today. So he also was a proponent of something called the unique selling proposition. And this is an idea in marketing that was started to become more and more accepted in the 40s and 50s. And it was the idea that you wanted to have your brand have a kind of a statement or a slogan or a so-called selling proposition that was linked to the brand, but it didn't have to be a kind of logic or reason-based statement at all. And so I've got a couple of examples here. For, Colgate cleans your breath while it cleans your teeth. M&M's melts in your mouth, not in your hands. Now, cleans your breath while it cleans your teeth. I'll bet you almost every toothpaste does that, right? And M&M's, well, there may be other kinds of pocket candy or whatever that category is called. There may be other types of things that will more or less do the same thing. They'll just kind of not melt in your, they'll melt in your mouth and not in your hand. So the idea that you think, well, how can that be a unique selling proposition, say for Colgate? And the reason for it is that you basically find out what kind of a statement or a slogan you want to develop. And you do that through research. And you do it extensively to find out what kind of a slogan or a selling proposition seems to kind of move people or seems to connect with people or has a ring to it or whatever. You do lots of research to determine that. And then basically you make that slogan stick through lots and lots of advertising. So in this case, after a while, like for example with Colgate, after enough Colgate advertising with that slogan, effectively Crest or other toothpaste they can't really start saying that, or they can't even broach a slogan that would be like that because Colgate already owns it by that point. So that's again, that comes out through the power of repetition. Now, there's a really good illustration of this in the video that you can click on now. And just before you do, I'll just set it up for you. So this is from an episode of Mad Men. It's 1960. Don Draper and the fellow ad execs are in this room, and the representatives from a tobacco company, American Tobacco, the makers of Lucky Strikes, are in. They're a client. And they're troubled because the U.S. government wants to put health warnings on cigarettes, and they're kind of flummoxed as to what kind of advertising approach they should adopt in this climate. And then Don Draper comes up with an idea that effectively is a USP. And so I want you to watch that, and then I will. I think I might raise that again in the tutorial on Tuesday. All right. Okay. So we'll move on. Reeves, as I've said before, believed in the power of repetition, audio-visual reinforcement, right? So television was the first format for advertising that combined audio and visual, right? And so it's not just a reinforcement of the visuals related to an ad campaign, but it's also the audio aspect of that as well. And you'll see that with the Anison ads I'll show. And he had this really interesting saying, or a maxim. Reeves believed that originality is the most dangerous word in advertising. Now, what he meant by that was, and perhaps it's best to sort of illustrate this for the types of campaigns that he would have worked on. So Reeves, say, if he was doing a Colgate, he might spend $10,000 producing a television ad, right? You got to pay the actors, you got to pay the people for writing the copy, production people, et cetera, et cetera. And this could be an ad that basically reinforces the message of cleans your breath while it cleans your teeth, okay? And so he starts running this ad, and after 6 months, the same ad keeps running over and over, saturating the airwaves. After a year, it's still running a lot. After 2 years, now, if you're the head of Colgate, you might be coming to Reeves and saying, "Hey, bud, I'm glad our sales are up with this Colgate advertising, but don't you think we should mix it up a bit? Don't you think we should maybe get some different type of advertising out there? It sounds to me like this advertising might be getting stale, right? I've just heard it so many times." And Reeves' response would be, "That's the point. It's supposed to feel kind of stale, because at a certain point it saturates the awareness of the public or the consumer, and they just come to sort of automatically accept that Colgate means X, and because of that, it's working. And the way that you make it not work is by mixing it up, is by introducing a new Colgate campaign or something like that." So his belief was that you figured out what the formula would be, and then you just ran with that for as long as you possibly could. So, it's not necessarily creative or artistic advertising, but for someone like Reeves, you did what worked best. All right, so here's Anison, and this is one of the marquee brands that Reeves worked with. Now, Anison was doing radio advertising in the late 40s, and then early 50s they switch over to television, and they start working with Bates and Rosser Reeves, and their sales go up remarkably in an 18-month period in the mid-50s, from about $18 million to just over $54 million. And what accounts for that is primarily the advertising. They launched this new campaign, and I've got an example of one of the ads that would have been part of that. And the advertising proved so effective that sales went up threefold in the course of a year and a half. Now, that may be great for the company, for the makers of Anison, but it's not necessarily a great thing for people that have to listen to the ad over and over, see the ad over and over. These Anison ads have been called the most hated commercials in the history of advertising. It's an interesting kind of statement, right? They're very effective, and yet they're also very hated because of the kind of over-the-top, overbearing, kind of repetitive messaging that's in them. So just before I ask you to look at those ads, when you watch them, think about the repetition in these ads and what some refer to as the power of threes that was quite prominent in Rosser Reeves advertising. And what you'll see is when you look at it, you'll see shots of three things, right? Three different brain captions or something like that. Fast, fast, fast pain relief. Over and over, you'll see things are iterated in terms of threes. Now, the thinking is that why would Reeves have sort of modeled his work on this power of threes so much? And some have argued that because of that Methodist upbringing, because of the fact that he was raised with Scripture, reading the Bible and going to church a lot, there in Scripture, you do have a lot of things framed in terms of threes: the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost, that sort of thing. And then the other thing is just the kind of voice of authority aspect of his ads. There's often a voiceover sort of towering over the listener or the viewer at times. And that could invoke the sense of the minister of the church sort of giving the sermon, or even the kind of voice of God aspect of that. So I could not embed these two ads in the slide for some reason. YouTube would not let me do that. I'm not sure why. So just look at those links there, and you'll get a sense of what we're talking about with respect to Anison advertising. All right? Okay. So this type of advertising in the 50s and 60s has been described by Thomas Frank, who is a cultural critic who wrote a very influential book on advertising in the 50s and 60s. And he was reflecting on the kind of inane, kind of formulaic sort of nature of the advertising, the research-driven formulas, the sense of a mass audience, the sense that you just wanted to say the same thing to everybody and not sort of targeting people in groups or something, and this idea of kind of groupthink, that it was everybody would sort of think the same way about what they wanted in the American dream. And according to Frank, he describes 50s advertising this way: never has advertising insisted so dogmatically on such an abstractly glowing vision of American life, and never has it been so vulnerable to mockery. And I want you to think about that. And the next slide asks you to look at about 7 or 8 ads, television ads from the 50s. Think about those ads you're going to see and see if there's anything in that sort of genre or that style of advertising that perhaps connects with you in the present day. Or do you really just see those ads as kind of something to be dismissed, something to be mocked? And the reason for this is that in 10 years, in the 1960s, you're going to start seeing advertising that I think is the exact opposite. It actually seems to be funny, sarcastic, witty, insightful, original, creative, etc., etc. The type of advertising I think that more reflects what we're used to today. So look at these ads from, there's about, I think there's 7 or 8 there, and this is just a compilation video I found on YouTube. One of the, I think, more better ones in terms of the illustrations that they have. So look at that, watch them, and then come back, and we'll do part 2. All right, thanks.